want to draw your attention in the bulletin to the GPS, the Grow, Praise, Study. There's a passage, there's some thoughts for you to reflect on each day during this coming week as we're trying to take a journey together as a congregation this summer. Want to encourage you to read these, reflect on these, talk about them with one another. Someone was asking me this morning if they could access this online, and the answer to that is not yet, but hopefully soon. But at this point, I encourage you to take these and use it as a devotional reflection each day. We've been talking about journey. Last week we began talking about a journey of faith for Abram, or Abram, whose name became Abraham, and his wife Sarai, whose name became Sarah. So whenever you hear me say Abram or Sarah, or Abram or Abraham today, or Sarai or Sarah, those are each the same people, the same husband and wife there. I don't know about you, but inefficiency drives me crazy. Or someone saying that they're going to do something and then doesn't follow through. That just really is something that frustrates me. And we've got a vendor that we work with here at the church that really has done a good job in terms of providing products and services for us. But a few months ago, they said, well, if you make this purchase, we'll send you a $20 gift card. And they keep saying they're going to send the gift card, but they keep failing to do it. That inefficiency or that failure to deliver on a promise is something that I find very frustrating. But what happens if God is inefficient? What happens if God doesn't follow through on His promises? Well, actually, it's not normally an issue of God not following through on His promises, but it's an issue of God not following through on His promises in the time that we think God should deliver. Last week we started talking about Abraham and Sarah. And it was an issue that God had given Abram several different promises. One of those promises was that He would give his descendants a land. That promised land, and it was an issue that actually several generations after Abraham lived that they finally inhabited the promised land. Another one of the promises that God made to Abram was that he would have an heir. Abram was 75 years old, and when it comes to starting a family, 75 years old seems a little bit old, but God promised Abram that he would have an heir. Well, the problem is that God didn't answer that promise as quickly as Abram thought He should. And so Abram and his wife Sarai decided to take that into their own hands. Listen to the story about what Abram and Sarai did, found in Genesis chapter 16. It says, "Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. So she said to Abram, the Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian maidservant Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. The first mistake that I want you to notice that Abram and Sarah make in this story is that they took matters into their own hands. When they took matters into their own hands, it was like they were saying to God, "God, this is too big for you. This is too big for you to figure out. This is too big for you to do on your own. And so we're going to decide how it is that Abram is going to have an heir." God eventually did fulfill the promise that He made to Abram. God fulfilled it in His way and in His time. But God fulfilled the promise 25 years after the promise was made. In Genesis chapter 18, God appears to Abraham and tells him that Sarah will have a child by that same time the next year. And then the Lord asks a question: is anything too hard for God? It's another one of those biblical questions that it's a question, yes, but it assumes that you know the answer. Is anything too hard for God? Of course not. Nothing is too hard for God. Now, don't want you to raise your hands, but how many of you are faced with a situation that kind of down deep, you have your doubts whether God's going to really help you come through on this one? That you've got some fears and some anxieties that, okay, you're not sure how this is all going to work out. The story is told of an impatient preacher. And that impatient preacher said, I've got a problem. I'm in a hurry. But God isn't. I'm in a hurry, but it seems that God isn't in a hurry. Have you ever felt that same way? That you're in a hurry for something to get accomplished, but God doesn't seem so pressed. God doesn't seem nearly as hurried as you are, but that could be because God sees the bigger picture. That same pastor went on to say, the hardest task in my life is to sit down and wait for God to catch up with me. Patience is a part of God's strategy for us to mature in our Christian walk, in our Christian journey. It's easy to become impatient with God and say, why aren't you working in my time? Why aren't you working this out as I want it to work out? We have some friends who have a prodigal daughter right now. The daughter's making some bad choices, and they're going through a lot of pain as a family. But in the midst of what our friends are going through, one of the affirmations that they continue to be able to speak is the fact that they realize that what their daughter is going through is not too big for God to handle. It's not too big for God to intervene. There's someone sitting here this morning that you believe you've taken a step of faith, but God somehow isn't keeping up on his part of the deal. You've taken a step of faith, but God isn't caring for the details of helping you to move forward with that step of faith in the timing that you want. Well, let me commend you for being willing to take a step of faith. But also let me assure you that God has not forgotten. God will work in his way and in his time. And you don't need to try and take things into your own hands and to circumvent God's perfect timing. This fruitful congregation's journey can feel a bit overwhelming sometimes as we've got these prescriptions, as we've gotten these goals, these things that initiatives we're trying to move forward as a congregation. And it's important for us to do our work. It's important for me to work hard in the process, but I've got to continue to remind myself that it's going to happen in God's time. I can trust God with the details. I can trust the results into God's hands. If you're wanting God to act and you're wondering what's taking him so long, let me encourage you to remember Abraham and Sarah and the fact that they tried to take things into their own hands, and in taking it into their own hands, they missed the blessing that God intended. Let me go ahead and read the rest of the story found in Genesis 16. It says, when Sarah knew Hagar was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. And then Sarai said to Abram, you are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my servant in your arms, and now that she knows that she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me. Your servant is in your hands, Abram said. Do with her whatever you think best. Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur, and she said to Hagar, and he said to Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress Sarai, she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, go back to the mistress and submit to her. The angel added, I will so increase your descendants that they will be too numerous to count. Well, in this passage, there are three other mistakes that I want us to look at that Abram and Sarai made. The second mistake I want you to notice in this story is that they failed to consider secondary consequences. They failed to consider unexpected consequences in this whole ordeal. Abram and Sarai thought that they could just get Hagar to be a surrogate mother and to produce a child so that Abram would have a descendant. But that wasn't God's plan. And so because that wasn't God's plan, the choice they made, even the sin they committed, had consequences that they were not expecting. You see, that one of the consequences was that Hagar and Sarai started to be at odds with one another. When Hagar's son Ishmael was born, and then several years later Sarai's son Isaac was born, Isaac and Ishmael were at odds with one another. And the scripture even goes on to say that Ishmael's descendants were always in conflict with someone. But do you know who the descendants of Ishmael are? It's the Arabs in the Middle East, the Muslims, those following Islam that are in conflict with the Jews being the descendants of Isaac. A secondary consequence of the decision that Abraham and Sarah made is the conflict that continues to go on today in the Middle East. Whenever you're watching a news broadcast and they're talking about the conflict in the Middle East, may you be reminded of secondary consequences of sin, or secondary consequences of what can happen when we get ahead of God. It's an issue that Abram experienced God's forgiveness in his life. We can experience God's forgiveness in our life when we've sinned, but when we experience God's forgiveness, it doesn't necessarily release us from the unexpected consequences or the secondary consequences of what we've done. The third mistake that Abram and Sarai made was that they thought that blaming each other would free them from responsibility. The ideas seemed to originate with Sarai, but Abram agreed that taking Sarai's handmaiden would be a way that he could produce an heir. So it's not that it was all Sarai's fault, because Abram agreed to the plan as well. But what happened when things started not going well? They started playing the blame game. James calls that blame game selfish ambition. We have selfish ambition when we are looking only out for ourselves. When we play the blame game, we're never going to resolve problems. And so it's an issue that, one of the mistakes that Abraham and Sarai made, instead of trying to make the best of the situation, they started blaming one another, and really nothing ever got resolved. The fourth mistake that I want you to see in this passage is that running away is not a good idea. Sarai mistreated Hagar, which she should not have done. But when Hagar left, Abram didn't do anything to bring her back. It was an issue that Abram probably thought, oh, good. Hagar's gone. Our problems are solved now. We're not going to have to deal with this conflict anymore. Hagar thought life would be easier if she was away from Sarai. But running or avoidance didn't resolve the problem. The story is told of two hunters that were out in the woods, and they were surprised as a bear came upon them. Well, they were so shocked by the bear that came upon them, they both dropped their rifles and began running. One climbed up a tree, another one went into a cave, and the bear kind of went over and just sat down between the cave and the tree. They weren't sure what they were going to do, but the hunter that had gone into the cave, he came running out because he was so scared and almost ran right into the bear that was in front of the cave. He turned around, ran back in, scared to death. Wasn't long, he came running out again. He ran back in. The third time he comes running out, and at that point his friend that was up in the tree said, "Woody, stay in the cave until the bear leaves." He says, "My problem is there's a bear in the cave also." That's what happens when we run from our problems. There's a problem every place we turn. There's a bear every place that we turn. We need to face our problems, and we need to deal with them. Running away from or avoiding our problems rarely solves anything. We've got problems at work. We've got a boss that's unreasonable. We've got a boss that's always picking on us. Well, the solution is, I'll just quit and I'll get another job. Get another job, and the next boss is unreasonable too. They expect you to show up on time. They expect you to work when you're on the clock. It's an issue that if we don't face our problems, if we don't make the changes that we need to make, what happens is they continue to repeat themselves. The same is the case in relationships and in marriages. In terms of, we can run from our problems, but if we run from our problems, it never really solves or resolves anything. We need to face those problems. We need to look at ourselves. We need to make the changes that are necessary. God is faithful to His promises. Let me encourage you to trust Him. But sometimes in trusting God, it can bring detours in our life. And when it is a God-ordained detour in our life, it's okay, because that detour is eventually going to get us to the place that God intends us to be. But sometimes detours in our life come because we've gotten ahead of God. We've tried to take things into our own hands. We've tried to force God's hand. If you've taken one of those detours, if you've experienced those secondary consequences because of choices that you've made, let me encourage you to seek God's forgiveness. But in seeking God's forgiveness when we've gotten out ahead of Him doesn't always change the consequences or the unintended consequences of those decisions that we've made. If you're feeling discontent or anxious this morning, maybe it's because you're in a bigger hurry than God is. You're wanting God to hurry up and catch up with you. But instead of trying to motivate God to hurry up or catch up, let me encourage you to hold on. For you to be patient, to wait for God to come and catch up and walk with you. The problem is not God's timing, but the problem is our timing. The problem is not God's timing. Even though it seems that God may only act in the nick of time, God's timing is always perfect. Hold on tight, because you can trust God.